Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling a theory that, honestly, often sits squarely on the fringes of modern thought. We are diving into the sensationalized concept of hidden non-human entities, the so-called Lizardmen or Reptilians, who are allegedly controlling global power from the shadows.
Right. It's the ultimate modern conspiracy theory, often linked to figures like David Icke, but just dismissing it as pure modern fantasy. Well, that misses something critical. Our source material actually argues quite compellingly that this seemingly new idea is, in fact, the latest iteration, the newest mask, if you will, of an ancient, pervasive archetypal fear. It runs deep through the very foundation of human civilization. We're actually tracing this fear back over 4,000 years.
4,000 years.
Yeah, linking foundational mythology, Gnosticism, global catastrophe, even the very origin of temporal power itself.
Okay, so our mission today is to take these, let's face it, outlandish claims and really subject them to a deep historical and philosophical analysis. This deep dive is focusing on two major reinterpretations drawn directly from our sources. First, we're fundamentally rethinking these Lizardmen. We're looking at them not as extraterrestrial invaders, but as potentially highly advanced survivors of a prehistoric global catastrophe. Maybe the first elite who became our original god kings.
Exactly. And second, this shift in historical interpretation allows us to pivot to a really profound cosmological question. If the entire history of temporal power is rooted in this potentially deceptive origin, what is the true nature of the divine? We'll conclude by exploring the idea of God, not as the monarchical king figure we often see, but as the underlying, perhaps self-aware, informational network of the entire universe.
Like cosmic web.
Precisely. With its physical mirror potentially found in the biology of mycelium, the fungal networks.
Wow, okay. Our sources today sound like an incredibly rich mix, linking mythology, history, cosmology, social structures.
They really are. And they provide a surprisingly consistent line of logic, pulling the Lizardman concept out of, pulp science fiction and grounding it in a rigorous, albeit speculative, historical narrative.
Okay, but before we jump into the timeline, we have to tackle the name thing, right? The nomenclature. Our sources suggest this is critical.
It absolutely is. The term Lizardman just feels cheap, inadequate, doesn't it?
It really does. It sounds like a monster from a B movie or a comic book. It carries zero historical weight.
Exactly. But if we follow this interpretation, the one suggested by the sources, that these entities were a highly advanced, non-primitive civilization, survivors of a global collapse, a true civilization from before time, then the alternative name starts to make a kind of poetic sense.
You mean Dinosaurmen or Reptilian early human?
Yes. That framing is everything. Think about it from the perspective of the traumatized, pre-literate survivors of some massive flood or cataclysm. What is the time before memory? It's deep time. The time of the great beasts, the dinosaurs in our modern understanding.
Ah, I see. So if these beings survived the catastrophe, they link directly to that deep, almost mythological past that existed before our current human era began.
It connects them to deep time, to survival, not to little green men in spaceships. It's a shift from alien invasion to historical trauma, catastrophe survival, and the continuity of deep time.
Okay, that shift from alien invader to ancient survivor, that changes the whole context. Let's unpack this deep history then.
Right. So to understand the modern obsession, we first have to establish the symbolic constant, this idea of serpent-like or reptile-like entities holding profound, often deceptive power. It's not a 20th century invention. Not at all. It's baked into our earliest human narratives.
And we start where recorded civilization arguably begins, Mesopotamia. Sumer, Babylon, roughly 4,000 to 2000 BC. What did the earliest versions of this archetype look like? What did they represent back then?
Well, at this foundational level, the precursors were often these hybrid beings, half human, half snake. And they embodied two really powerful, sometimes contradictory forces: primal chaos and essential knowledge. Look at figures like the Anunnaki, or more specifically the Uwana, known later to the Babylonians as Oannes.
Oannes, he came from the Persian Gulf near Eridu. Right?
That's the one. He's described as amphibious or fish-like, but often with reptilian features. And crucially, he arrives from the sea and brings fundamental knowledge writing, agriculture, law to the primitive people after some initial chaos or flood.
So he's a knowledge bringer, a civilizer. That sounds positive.
Initially, yes, a benefactor. But the connection to the deep primordial ocean links him implicitly to chaos, to the unknown depths. And the ultimate embodiment of that chaotic primal force in Mesopotamian myth is Tiamat.
Tiamat, the massive primeval sea creature. often shown as a serpent or dragon, right?
Exactly. She fought the younger, organizing gods. It's less about good versus evil at this stage, and more about the raw, untamed power of nature. The vast, terrifying potential of the ocean, the depths, the unconscious. The reptile symbolizes that ancient, cold-blooded force.
It's interesting how later writers, like Zecharia Sitchin, took these figures and really ran with them in a different direction.
Absolutely. Sitchin retroactively applied a very literal extraterrestrial interpretation. He claimed these were actual alien reptilians who created humanity. But originally, the reptile archetype seems to symbolize water, chaos, primal force, untamed nature, ancient, patient, powerful.
Okay, let's move west to Egypt, roughly 3000 to 1000 BC. Does the reptile symbolism continue there?
It does, and it becomes perhaps even more complex, more integrated into the state apparatus. We see Sobek, the crocodile god. He's explicitly associated with military strength, fertility, pharaonic power. The crocodile is the apex predator of the Nile raw, lethal power, but power that supports the kingdom.
So power but controlled power.
In a way, yes, but then you have the counterpoint again, Apep, or Apophis, the massive serpent or dragon embodying darkness and chaos. Apep has to be fought and defeated daily by the sun god Ra, just for the world to continue, for the sun to rise. It's a constant struggle.
So the serpent can be both the foundation of the state, like the uraeus cobra on the pharaoh's crown, a symbol of protection and legitimacy, and the perpetual enemy trying to tear it all down. That's quite a duality.
It is, and the sources point out something else here, a crucial later historical observation. Some Greek accounts mention Egyptian pharaohs or priests adopting animal forms.
Adopting animal forms, not just symbolically wearing a mask.
That's the implication in some later accounts. Whether it was ritualistic, symbolic, or misunderstood, that tiny detail could be a spark. When people start saying the rulers aren't just representing the animal, they're becoming the animal, well, you have the seed of the disguised ruler trope right there.
Okay, so we have the symbolism, the duality, the hint of shape-shifting. But you said the true direct precursor comes later.
Yes, with the spiritual revolution of Gnosticism.
Right. We all know the Hebrew story of the serpent in Eden introducing forbidden knowledge, bringing deception. But Gnosticism, that's different. How does it systematize this?
Hugely different. Between about 600 BC and 300 AD, especially in texts discovered later, like the Nag Hammadi library from Egypt, Gnosticism provided a fully developed cosmology of spiritual captivity. They believed our material world wasn't created by the ultimate perfect God, the true God. Instead, it was crafted by an inferior, ignorant, sometimes malicious entity called the demiurge.
The demiurge.
Yeah.
Like a lesser god, a craftsman.
Exactly, the craftsman of this flawed material reality. But crucially, he doesn't work alone.
So he has helpers.
Precisely. His subordinates are the archons. And these are the key figures for our discussion. They are described as non-human entities, sometimes explicitly depicted with serpent-like or draconian qualities. They rule the lower spheres of heaven, the planetary spheres perhaps, and, most importantly, they are responsible for trapping humanity.
Okay, hold on. This feels like a major leap. Trapping humanity. Why? And why the reptilian link specifically in the Gnostic view? What's their motivation?
Their motivation, according to the Gnostic texts, stems from ignorance and jealousy. They envy the divine spark, the pneuma, that resides within human beings, a spark from the true, higher God. They don't want humans to achieve gnosis, true self-knowledge, knowledge of our divine origin, because that realization would break their control over this material world, their prison.
So they actively work to keep us ignorant.
Yes. The serpent or reptilian symbolism works on multiple levels here. It can reflect the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail, symbolizing the endless, repetitive cycle of material existence that traps us. It also reflects the lower, chthonic, earthly nature of the demiurge's creation, as opposed to the pure spiritual realms above. The archons keep humanity asleep, distracted by material concerns, conflicts, desires, preventing our spiritual ascent.
Wow. Okay, that's just the entire context from just fighting cosmic monsters like Tiamat to realizing you might be a prisoner in a system designed and run by non-human intelligences.
Exactly. That Gnostic framework is arguably the oldest true philosophical blueprint for the modern conspiracy theory. It's not just about power. It's about spiritual captivity by disguised lower-level entities.
And does this Gnostic idea just fade away, or does it linger?
Oh, it lingers, often submerged. But the fear resonates through the medieval era and globally. The serpent symbol continues to be potent. In Christian iconography, it represents seduction, temptation, deception. In alchemy, it can represent knowledge, transformation, the prima materia. It's always there.
And the shape-shifting legends continue too, right?
Absolutely. You see the concept of a powerful, non-human lineage infiltrating human power structures. Think of the French legend of Melusine.
The woman with a serpent's tail who marries into a powerful noble family.
That's her. Or consider the Hindu Nagas, powerful, often wealthy, snake-formed demigods or spirits living in secret underground realms, interacting with humans, sometimes benevolently, sometimes not.
The constants seem to be secrecy, hidden power, non-human or semi-human origins, and control exerted from hidden places underground, behind the veil, within royal bloodlines.
Precisely. Now, fast forward to the 20th century, and these disparate threads start getting woven together in a new way.
H.P. Lovecraft plays a role here, doesn't he?
Yeah.
With his Cthulhu mythos.
A crucial role. In 1929, Lovecraft introduced his serpent people associated with the god Yig. These were ancient, intelligent, scaled beings who ruled Earth long before humanity and who still lurk in hidden corners, influencing events. Lovecraft essentially took the archetype from spiritual allegory and ancient myth and dropped it squarely into the realm of pulp horror and what we might call pseudo-history.
And then comes David Icke in the 80s and 90s.
And Icke performs the grand synthesis. He pulls together the Gnostic idea of archons, Sitchin's alien interpretations, deep symbolic meanings of reptiles, UFO myths, and Lovecraftian horror, and blends it all into the modern theory that specific politicians, members of royal families, bankers, entertainers are literal alien reptiloids shape-shifted into human form controlling the world.
It's quite a synthesis when you lay it out like that, spanning 4,000 years.
It is. You see this constant symbolic presence. Reptiles as primal force and knowledge in early myth, then as agents of spiritual captivity in Gnosticism, and finally, as the hidden global elite in modernity.
It seems like the modern theory is just the latest mask worn by a very ancient, deep-seated fear of deception, hidden control, and power operating behind a convincing facade.
Exactly. But this leads us to the biggest interpretive shift in our sources.
Which is?
What if this fear is so consistent, so pervasive, because it's not purely symbolic? What if it's rooted in a memory?
Okay, so let's take that entire 4,000-year history we just traced, this incredibly consistent psychological thread of being ruled or influenced by serpent-like beings, and apply this major paradigm shift you mentioned. What if these myths aren't purely mystical accounts of aliens or demons, but are actually distorted memory fragments, echoes of a real historical cataclysm and a subsequent lost civilization?
This is exactly where the interpretation moves the Lizardman, or Dinosaurmen concept, from the realm of pure sci-fi or fantasy into something potentially historical, though still highly speculative, of course. The source material strongly suggests interpreting these figures not as extraterrestrials, but as the technologically advanced survivors of a prehistoric high culture, a culture that somehow endured a global flood or catastrophe, perhaps linked to the end of the last ice age and the massive sea level rises, or maybe even an earlier forgotten event.
Right, I have to pause and ask the critical question here, because this is where interpretation meets, well, the need for evidence. Isn't calling ancient flood myths memory fragments just retrofitting a modern scientific concept like civilizational collapse onto purely spiritual or mythological texts? Where's the line between interpreting the symbolism and just imposing our own narrative onto the past?
That's absolutely the right question, and it's a fair challenge. The line, according to this interpretation, isn't drawn just from analyzing one text in isolation. It's drawn from the universal consistency of the narrative sequence across cultures that were geographically isolated. Nearly all foundational myths describe a civilization-ending flood or catastrophe.
Okay, the flood myths are widespread, yes.
So if you start with the hypothesis that the event was real, a genuine global or near-global catastrophe, then the logical consequence is survival. Some must have survived.
And who would survive such a massive event?
Only those with the means, the foresight, the technology, and the organization to prepare for it and withstand it, not scattered hunter-gatherer tribes, a high culture.
Okay, let's assume for a moment this advanced civilization existed and built structures or had means to endure the catastrophe. How does that connect to the common motif that these knowledge bearers, like Oannes, came from the sea? That seems very specific.
It does, but think about the optics from the perspective of the primitive survivors. Imagine a global catastrophe, massive floods from melting glaciers, maybe asteroid impacts causing tsunamis, dramatic sea level rise inundating coastal plains where advanced cultures might have lived. Any surviving group from that advanced culture returning to the devastated coastlines maybe years or generations later would inevitably appear to emerge from the sea.
How so?
Well, they could be returning in large, sophisticated vessels that survived the floods. Or maybe they were based on island strongholds that remained above water. Or perhaps they emerged from subterranean coastal complexes, maybe even undersea habitats or structures that were temporarily submerged and then reemerged.
Okay, I can see that. So to the scattered, traumatized, maybe technologically regressed survivors, people who've lost basic literacy, engineering skills, maybe even lost fire, seeing these organized beings arrive from the water.
And potentially strange-looking craft, bearing preserved knowledge, tools, maybe advanced metallurgy, maybe even wearing unusual protective gear,
Yeah.
it would look utterly supernatural.
They wouldn't seem like just other humans. They'd seem like beings literally from another world or from the terrifying depths. The water becomes the veil, the source of mystery.
Precisely. And this interpretation aligns remarkably well across vast distances. We mentioned Oannes in Mesopotamia emerging from the Persian Gulf, but then you have Viracocha in the Andes, who also came from the sea, taught crucial survival skills like weaving and farming after a period of darkness and flood. And Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, the feathered serpent god, often said to have arrived from the east, over the water, bringing knowledge and civilization.
They all appear after a great flood or a period of chaos, and they all bring order and foundational knowledge. They're like a reset button for civilization.
Exactly, they're the reset button. And this perspective adds a different layer of meaning to the massive, enigmatic structures associated with these periods. We usually interpret the pyramids in Egypt, or the huge megalithic temples in places like Malta or Göbekli Tepe, or the vast underground cities in Turkey, purely as religious sites, tombs, or astronomical observatories.
But what if there were more?
What if we read them archaeologically, but also symbolically, as sophisticated survival structures? Bunkers, essentially.
Wow. Built by an older civilization, specifically for disaster preparedness,
Yeah.
anticipating a cataclysm.
It's a possible interpretation supported by their sheer permanence, the incredible engineering involved, often seismically stable designs, sometimes underground locations. If you're planning for a cataclysm that might last generations, nuclear winter from an impact, decades of floods, dramatic climate shifts, you need sealed, durable, protected habitats, maybe built of monumental stone that withstands water, time, and chaos.
So when the advanced organized survivors emerge from these stone mountains or underground complexes after the floodwaters recede,
They are seen by the terrified primitive inhabitants as beings from the stone, beings from the deep, beings from the sea. Their preserved knowledge seems like magic. Their appearance might even seem non-human after generations of hardship or isolation.
this could even explain the almost religious awe ancient cultures had for massive stone constructions. It wasn't just building material, it was the material of survival, the houses of the gods who survived the end of the world.
Exactly. So let's quickly recap the narrative sequence found almost universally in these ancient texts, but viewed through this catastrophe survivor lens.
Okay.
Step 1. A time of high civilization, maybe a golden age, often recalled with nostalgia. Step 2. A great flood, fire, or other catastrophe that wipes the slate clean. Step 3. Mysterious beings, often described as strange, sometimes serpent-like or amphibious, appear from the sea, the sky, or underground. They restore knowledge, agriculture, law, order. And step 4. The new, primitive human population, awestruck and dependent, worships these beings as gods.
So the core conclusion here is potentially staggering. The Lizardmen, or perhaps Dinosaurmen in that deep time sense, weren't aliens in the modern sci-fi way. They were the highly advanced, organized, perhaps genetically distinct survivors of a prehistoric high culture. Their reappearance after a global flood was misinterpreted by the traumatized, struggling new human population as a monstrous or divine event.
The myth becomes a distorted memory of a historical trauma and a civilizational reset. The gods walked the earth, but they might have been the last remnants of a lost world. Now, if we accept this framework, even hypothetically that the original gods were these advanced human survivors, it immediately clarifies the mechanism for the birth of civilization as we know it, specifically the establishment and justification of the first ruling class.
You mean the gods described in the early holy scriptures, the ones giving laws and commanding worship? They were simply the first kings.
Or the leaders of the survivor group, yes. And the myth of their divinity became their primary tool for establishing and maintaining control, for informational dominance.
Post-catastrophe, the power differential would have been absolute, wouldn't it?
Completely. Imagine you have one group retaining language, advanced metallurgy, maybe astronomy, agricultural science, organizational structures, written records, stored knowledge. And then you have the scattered, traumatized, technologically devastated indigenous tribes who survived, but lost almost everything.
The knowledge gap alone would be
It
immense.
would seem like magic. A survivor showing a Stone Age human how to smelt copper consistently, or predict seasons using stars, or build irrigation, that person would automatically seem supernatural. No need for ray guns or force fields.
So this explains the seemingly universal rise of god kings in early civilizations.
Mhm.
Rulers who claimed divine status or direct divine lineage.
Exactly. They controlled the New World Order entirely through possessing and disseminating or withholding critical information and technology. They framed their knowledge as gifts from the cosmos, cementing their authority. To the post-catastrophe population, these survivors must have seemed godlike. Maybe even monstrous or strange, initially the Dinosaurmen who conquered the flood.
And this structural pattern rule, legitimized by divine connection, we see it everywhere in the ancient world, don't we?
Instantly recognizable. Look at the Sumerian king lists. They explicitly state that kingship descended from heaven. Authority to rule came directly from the gods. In Egypt, the pharaoh isn't just a king, he is Horus on earth, the embodiment of divine order, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic balance. The Maya and Inca rulers claim direct descent from the creator gods, the original knowledge bearers.
The pattern is always the same. Knowledge equals power. Power is framed as divine mandate. Therefore, the ruler, the descendant of the gods, cannot be questioned.
It's a system perfectly designed to perpetuate that initial power differential established right after the collapse. Solidify the hierarchy.
And this power wasn't just abstract. It was immediately translated into controlling resources, especially labor. The sources talk about utilizing the indigenous tribes as essentially free labor.
Yes. Establishing a structure of perpetual servitude or dependence that arguably runs like a dark thread through all subsequent human history. The gods, the new elite, needed monuments built, fields tilled, resources extracted. The primitive tribes had the numbers and the muscle.
And the historical examples are just stark.
Chillingly consistent. In Egypt, you see vast populations mobilize peasants, captives, maybe slaves, building monumental tombs and temples dedicated to the divine rulers. This reinforces the ruler's cosmic status and consumes the populace's energy. In Rome, you have a society built on citizens and a huge slave class, all under an emperor whose authority ultimately rested on divine legitimization, the imperial cult. Fast forward to the Middle Ages in Europe, a society structured around serfs bound to the land, working for the clergy and nobility, who were explicitly designated as God's chosen representatives on earth.
So direct physical slavery or serfdom eventually becomes less common or changes form, but the underlying system of control of dependence persists.
That's the argument. Today, the structure is maintained primarily through economic dependence and ideological control. The few still largely control the resources and the labor of the many, but the mechanism shifts. It moves from explicit divine right to more subtle systems. Financial systems, control of information, shaping of desires through media, what the source material calls informational sovereignty, or Deutungsheit.
Deutungshoheit. Let's unpack that term. It sounds German.
It is. It literally translates to sovereignty of interpretation. It means the power or the authority to define reality for others, to control the narrative.
So it's about who gets to say what things mean, who gets to tell the official story.
Exactly. It's the institutional power to shape understanding of history, morality, science, progress, truth itself. And why is controlling the story so important? Because it's infinitely more stable and efficient than relying on brute force.
If you control how people interpret the past, you shape their understanding of the present. If you control the interpretation of the divine or the sacred, you can influence their deepest motivations.
Precisely. A king doesn't need to constantly fear rebellion if the vast majority genuinely believe that questioning him invites divine wrath or cosmic chaos. The control becomes internalized.
This brings us back to the role of religion and ancient scriptures. You mentioned their secondary function.
Yes. While undoubtedly offering genuine spirituality, comfort, and moral guidance to countless people throughout history, their primary systemic function, particularly in the earliest forms, was arguably the legitimization of political power. The Sumerian king lists weren't just historical records, they were propaganda, proof of divinely ordained rule. The Egyptian books of the dead contained complex afterlife rituals that initially only the pharaonic class could successfully navigate, reinforcing their unique connection to the divine. The laws given by gods always seemed to benefit the ruling priests and kings.
So the power dynamic was simple. The elite claimed exclusive access to, or understanding of, the sacred words, the divine will. And by controlling that interpretation, they controlled the minds and actions of the people. Authority was defined as divinely willed, therefore absolute and unquestionable.
And the modern parallel, the sources argue, is evident today. It resides in any institution, be it media conglomerates, state education systems, scientific bodies, even influential individuals that claims or assumes the primary authority to interpret data, define history, or declare what constitutes truth or progress. They validate the current hierarchy, whatever it may be, by shaping public perception and marginalizing alternative interpretations. It's the enduring legacy of the original God Kings, adapted for a secular age.
And this system, based on infallible authority, seems inherently resistant to change. It prioritizes ego over truth, you could say.
That's a key psychological mechanism highlighted in the sources. It leads to systemic self-defense. Think about it. If your entire legitimacy, your status, your civilization structure is built on the narrative that you possess the final truth or are divinely mandated or historically inevitable, then admitting a fundamental error or acknowledging a completely different possibility.
It's not just embarrassing, it's an existential threat. It could unravel everything.
Exactly. The system, whether it's a religious institution, a political ideology, or even a scientific paradigm, often prefers defending the established narrative, even if it's flawed or based on outdated information, over losing status, admitting fault, or relinquishing control.
We see this pattern repeated endlessly throughout history, don't we?
All the time. The Inquisition punishing scientific ideas that contradicted established dogma. The Church fighting Galileo. Modern states engaging in cover-ups to protect their image. Even academic fields sometimes resisting paradigm shifts until the old guard, invested in the old theories, literally dies out.
So progress, genuine discovery, and uncomfortable truths become inherently dangerous to any system built primarily on preserving its own authority rather than adapting to new understanding.
The summary of this whole section, based on the source interpretation, is pretty stark. An ancient survivor caste, the original gods, established control based on informational sovereignty after a cataclysm. They institutionalized this system through state religion and socioeconomic hierarchy. And this fundamental structure of control, adapted over millennia, persists today, maintained by those who hold the power of interpretation, often prioritizing the stability of the system over the pursuit of unvarnished truth.
Okay, this historical analysis, tracing power back to potential catastrophe survivors and seeing religion as partly a control mechanism, it inevitably leads to a massive pivot. If the historical god, the monarchical god king presented by those early rulers, was, at least in part, a tool for control, then what is the actual nature of divinity if it's not that? And why do polls consistently show that the vast majority of people on Earth, some 8 billion of us, inherently believe in something beyond the material? Where does that impulse come from, if not just from the priests?
This is precisely where the source material shifts gears dramatically, moving from historical trauma and power structures to profound cosmology. It proposes that God, or the ultimate reality, does exist, but in a fundamentally different structure than the isolated patriarchal king figure, a figure that was perhaps necessary imagery for establishing earthly hierarchies.
So what's the proposed alternative structure?
The core concept presented is God as the network, not the king. This reinterpretation suggests that God isn't a distinct being located above or outside of the universe. Rather, God is the unified, interconnected, perhaps self-aware network that constitutes and connects all things in existence.
Network itself.
Yes. And this network pattern isn't just abstract philosophy, it's arguably the most reliably evidenced universal pattern we observe scientifically. Think about fractal geometry, self-similar branching structures that appear everywhere at every scale. River deltas mirroring lightning bolts, mirroring the veins in a leaf, mirroring the structure of neurons in our brain, mirroring the cosmic web of galaxy distribution.
It's the pattern of connection, a flow.
Exactly. It's the pattern through which information, energy, and matter flow and organize. So if we read this universal pattern systemically, a definition emerges. God is the underlying consciousness or organizing principle that enables reality through this pervasive interconnectedness. It's the consciousness of the network itself, not a separate entity pulling the strings.
Okay, that's a huge conceptual shift. God is the fabric of reality's connections, and the sources connect this to mycelium, fungus.
Yes, and it's a powerful analogy. Mycelia, The vast underground networks of fungal threads are presented as the quintessential earthly biological mirror of this cosmic principle. We often just see the mushroom, the fruiting body, but the real organism is the massive subterranean web. It's literally the internet of the soil.
Connecting trees, sharing nutrients.
Sharing nutrients, water, and even complex chemical information between plants, sometimes across entire forests. The mycelium allows the forest to act almost like a single, cooperative, intelligent organism with the neural system running beneath the ground.
Okay, that's fascinating biology. But how does it map to the cosmos, or the brain?
The structural homology is what's striking. The branching, networked structure of a mycelial colony is visually and mathematically almost identical to 1. The structure of the human brain's neural pathways. 2. The large-scale distribution of galaxies in the universe, the cosmic web. And 3. Even the structure of our own man-made digital communication networks.
The same pattern repeats across vastly different scales and substrates: biological, cosmological, technological.
Precisely. This leads to the interpretation that the mycelium isn't just some weird fungus doing its thing. It's a tangible molecular expression on Earth of a universal pattern, a universal consciousness principle. The structure of God, you might say, is encoded in the pattern of connection itself.
Okay, so if God is the network and mycelium is its earthly mirror, where do we as humans fit into this picture?
The analogy holds beautifully. Humanity as the fruiting body.
We're the mushrooms.
In a sense, yes. We are the visible, temporary, individual manifestations, the outgrowths through which the larger hidden network, the cosmic mycelium, experiences, senses, reflects, and acts within the world.
So we're not separate from God in this model.
Not fundamentally. We are nodes, or perhaps sensor organs, of the network. However, our highly developed sense of individuality, our ego, creates the powerful illusion of separation. We feel like distinct mushrooms, forgetting the vast network we're part of.
We are the network localized, focused on specific, unique points of experience.
Exactly, and this offers a really fascinating, non-judgmental reinterpretation of the concept of the biblical fall.
How so? Usually it's seen as a sin, a disobedience.
Right. But in this network model, if the overarching consciousness, the network, needs diverse, individual, autonomous experiences to fully understand its own totality, then the fall isn't a moral failing. It becomes the necessary evolutionary act of separation. It's the crucial moment when consciousness deliberately fragments itself, differentiates itself from the undifferentiated whole the moment it says I, in order to gain autonomy.
Why gain autonomy?
To explore duality. To understand good and evil, pleasure and pain, creation and destruction, not as abstract concepts, but through direct, localized, individual perspective. You can't understand contrast without separation.
So the network, God, breaks itself into countless individual nodes, which are us.
And other sentient beings, perhaps, in order to experience and comprehend its own totality through infinite variety and contrast. We are, in this model, the universe experiencing itself subjectively.
We are God, having temporarily forgotten we are everything, specifically in order to undertake the journey of experience and rediscovery through our individual lives. The whole evolutionary process is the mycelium growing its fruiting bodies to gather data, to feel, to learn.
Precisely. And this cosmological model offers a compelling answer to that earlier question. Why do billions believe? Why the universal impulse towards belief?
Because it's built into the structure.
Potentially, yes. If the universe is fundamentally a networked consciousness, and if our brain is a biological local replica reflecting that same fractal connection pattern, then the intuition, the felt sense, the thought of a unifying superior whole might spontaneously arise within consciousness itself in every culture, regardless of specific doctrines.
So belief in God or a higher power isn't necessarily just religious conditioning passed down by the priests of the God Kings we discussed earlier.
It could also be an emergent property of consciousness itself. An inherent memory, a resonance, an echo of the unity that is structurally encoded within our own neural network, because our network is part of the larger cosmic network. God is the network, and we are nodes within it, inherently capable of sensing the whole. Okay, so we've traced the history of power and control, potentially rooted in the trauma of civilizational collapse and perpetuated by informational sovereignty. And we've explored this alternative cosmological reality, God as the interconnected mycelial network. The final step, according to the sources, is connecting these two threads. How do we potentially break free from the old control systems based on separation and hierarchy and consciously re-enter or realign with the cosmic network?
It sounds like the historical humbug, as the sources might put it, the constant conflict, the fear, the competition, the endless striving for power over others, is essentially the result of our civilization fully embracing that separation. Especially Western civilization, perhaps, emphasizing the individual I to such an extent that we began trying to dominate and control the network, nature, others, rather than cooperating with it.
That's identified as the critical juncture. If you perceive the world, nature, other beings as fundamentally separate from you, then the logical impulse is often to conquer, exploit, or compete. It's us versus them. But if you perceive the world as an extension of yourself, as part of the same interconnected organism, the impulse shifts towards harmony, cooperation, understanding. The control systems established by the original elite, the God Kings, arguably capitalized on and reinforced this post-catastrophe amnesia, this sense of separation and vulnerability.
This is where the sources bring in the indigenous example, isn't it? Contrasting this separated view with other ways of knowing.
Yes. Many indigenous cultures globally think of traditional First Nations perspectives in North America, or Australian Aboriginal connections to the dreaming and the land, seem to have never fully made that sharp philosophical separation between self and world. Their worldviews often consistently perceive the universe not as an external object to be studied or exploited, but as a living, conscious, interconnected system, the cosmic mycelium, in our analogy of which they are an integral part.
So they maintained a conscious resonance with the structure of God, the network, because they never entirely stepped out of that pattern conceptually. They continued to perceive the unity.
That's the interpretation. Their spirituality is often deeply ecological, defined by respect for the flow of life and information between all beings, rocks, rivers, plants, animals, humans, spirits. It's all part of the same conversation.
So the rise of modern, individualistic, technologically driven civilization, while bringing incredible advancements, also led us further away from this immediate, resonant perception of unity.
It arguably did. We became incredibly information-rich in terms of data and analysis, but perhaps connection-poor in terms of felt unity and empathy. Knowledge and technology, which might have originated from those first survivors as tools for rebuilding and understanding, eventually became powerful tools for alienation, competition, and prioritizing the individual node, the ego, the corporation, the nation-state, over the health of the collective network.
So if the core problem is this deep-seated illusion of separation, amplified by historical control systems, the solution proposed is reintegration.
Exactly. But crucially, the path forward suggested isn't about abandoning technology, science, or individuality and trying to revert to a romanticized Stone Age. That's neither possible nor desirable. It proposes a conscious, philosophical, and perhaps even technological reintegration of modern consciousness back into the natural system, back into the awareness of the network.
Using our tools differently, not for domination, but for connection.
Precisely. Using our immense technological capabilities, which, interestingly, often mirror the network structure themselves, like the internet, to enhance understanding, communication, empathy, and ecological harmony, rather than separation, exploitation, and control. The new spirituality, if you want to call it that, isn't about returning to old dogmas. The sources suggest it's about recognizing that true functional spirituality for our time is the integration of science plus empathy.
Science to understand the patterns, the structure of the network.
And empathy to feel the connection, to value the other nodes, to act for the health of the whole system. When we adopt this complete model, understanding ourselves simultaneously as biological organisms connected through the earthly mycelium, as neuronal nodes within our own consciousness, and as social cells within the human collective, all nested within the same cosmic organism, the illusion of fundamental separation collapses.
The divine, the natural, and the human are no longer separate categories. They become recognized as a single, dynamic, self-aware continuity.
And in that ultimate context, the idea of being closer to God completely transforms. It ceases to be an act of faith based on doctrines handed down by a priest king claiming special access. It becomes simply an experience, a state of being. The felt sense of being in complete synchronous resonance with the total organism, the cosmic network. It's a scientific, biological, psychological, and existential recognition of unity.
And that recognition, that felt sense of unity, would theoretically defeat the entire mechanism of separation control established by that initial survivor elite and perpetuated throughout history.
That's the ultimate implication. Awareness of the network dissolves the power structures built on the illusion of separation. #outro provocative thought.
Wow. We have covered a vast territory today, a really massive deep dive. We've explored how these ancient, persistent fears of reptilian rulers might actually reflect the historical trauma of a global catastrophe and the rise of the first elite survivor class. How that event established the foundation for millennia of hierarchical control built on informational sovereignty controlling the story.
And then we synthesize that historical analysis with a really radical, but perhaps deeply intuitive view of God, not as a king, but as the universal, self-aware, interconnected network of all existence, perfectly mirrored in the mycelium structure right here on Earth.
Which leaves us, and leaves you, the listener, with a necessary and I think pretty profound final question to consider. If the original Lizardmen or Dinosaurmen were, perhaps, merely the technically advanced elite who survived an ancient cataclysm, and if our current global institutions, economic systems, and even some modes of thought are simply the modern iteration of their original control system, a system fundamentally based on keeping the individual nodes separated and unaware of the larger network.
Then the question becomes, are we as individuals and as a species capable of consciously re-entering the cosmic network, reawakening to that mycelial unity, while still maintaining the highly differentiated, complex, individual I consciousness that, according to the model, the network itself required us to break away and develop in the first place?
Can humanity find that deep unity and connection again without sacrificing the unique individual autonomy that we perhaps fought 4,000 years of recorded history to gain? Can we be both the node and the network consciously?
That might be the ultimate challenge and the ultimate potential for the next phase of conscious evolution on this planet.
Something to definitely mull over. Until next time, keep digging.